Well, my talk follows quite naturally from the last one. The thing which is going to run through all of this is optimism bias. Most people who call for eradication have extreme versions of optimism bias, and I'll explain why that's specifically a problem in eradication in a way that it is not in others. Lots of people say you should be optimistic. I'm personally extremely optimistic about multiple things, and without optimism we would never start, but with false optimism we will definitely fail when it comes to eradication, and there's a lot of false optimism out there. Now, eradication is clearly, in essence, very simple. By our efforts in our generation, and you can make this very, very emotive if you wish to, we will spare all future generations. Fantastic. Invest now, save for all time. Now, a lot of the economic analyses of this, I have to say, are advocacy, not science. But nevertheless, there are some examples where it is true, and I think smallpox is a very good example. Clearly a fantastic investment. So when chosen wisely, it makes sense. It clearly motivates, involves and incites people who are not normally in public health. So a lot of people came into public health, Rockefeller actually is probably one of them, drawn in by the excitement of being one of the people involved in eradication. The extraordinary engagement, remarkable engagement by the Rotary clubs internationally, for example, in polio eradication. These are people who wouldn't necessarily otherwise be in public health. So this can have some very positive political issues as well. And epidemiologically, it's also very straightforward. You must have R0, force of transmission, below 1 everywhere for long enough to get there. That's it. There's really, I mean, one can overcomplicate it, but that fundamentally is all you have to do. The problem with eradication is that the early attack phase always works. If it doesn't, you're definitely going to fail, and you'll fail fast. But if, unless you've done a really stupid idea, it's going to work. The problems all start in the tail end of this, and this is in the tail end, at the final bit, the final mile, as people keep on saying, but actually it's usually final many thousands of miles, that takes you from very good control over the line to a point where everywhere R0 is below 1 and it is being eradicated. That is where the problems occur. And the reason that is a problem is people who plan eradication attempts and are optimistic are doing so up here. So they're very optimistic and they don't get hit by reality in the first few years, because in the first few years everything goes right. And it keeps on going right, really till quite near the end. And then I'll explain why it is that then the end becomes problematic. It is very clear, and many of the general lessons I'm drawing are from the multiple previous attempts at eradication which have failed. I've written just a few of them here, there are many. It's very clear that we've tried and failed on several occasions. So let's start off with a few of the ones which are partial successes, and then explain why they're problematic as individual diseases. And this is to illustrate the point that every disease throws up its own particular problems, and then I'm going to talk about some general problems which are, in a sense, universal to any eradication attempt you try anywhere. Let's start off with the leprosy eradication campaign. Terrible disease, no doubt getting rid of it would be a phenomenal way forward, and a decision was made to eliminate it as a public health problem in 1991. And this was defined, as I've written up here, as 1 per 10,000 cases. The prevalence is what we were going for, and the prevalence fell dramatically. We reached our goal by the year 2000. Great. Problem is, the incidence did not. And so what you had is a situation where the prevalence fell dramatically, but the incidence actually, in many countries, Brazil, India, for example, basically was hardly changed. How do you explain this as an epidemiologist? And the answer is, the way that prevalence was defined, the way that cases were defined, meant it was very easy to collapse prevalence. Anyone who was on treatment was essentially removed as a case. You cleaned out all the old cases. You redefined, there were multiple redefinitions, each one of which made it more and more difficult for someone to be a prevalent case, till you get to the point where you're extremely near zero. These do not actually affect incidence. Now, there was a real achievement in terms of elimination in the leprosy campaign. That was, it almost entirely managed to eliminate research and political will and money, because everyone had been told that eradication was coming, that it was almost there, and everyone else thought, okay, we'll take the money we're giving to leprosy and we'll put it elsewhere. The effects on leprosy research and on leprosy control have been dramatic and bad. So that's the first example. If you want to go through the details of this, I'd recommend an excellent paper by Rodriguez and Lockwood, recently the BMJ, just going through some of the failures of the leprosy campaign. Or yours. Yours was mentioned earlier on. There was, and again, an initially successful campaign to eradicate yours, and to some extent it worked pretty well. Firstly, there were a number of technical problems people had not actually picked up early on. For example, they'd not picked up latency early on. And secondly, we had the usual problem that when we get close to zero, people get disinterested, money dries up, and then you get a resurgence. And I'll explain politically why that is at the end, and I've got a slightly different take from the last talk. We do have better drugs now, we have better diagnostics, but for reasons I'll come on to, I don't think that necessarily spells that we're going to be successful if we try to eradicate yours. And then guinea worm. Guinea worm will be a successful eradication campaign. It's a horrible disease. Enormous collapsing of cases. As the first speaker, for those who here then, pointed out, we're now down to 126 cases in the last year. I'd like to make 2 points about the guinea worm eradication campaign, and to be clear, DFID, for whom I work, although I want to be really clear that I'm not speaking for them in this is a personal view throughout this talk, has put a lot of money behind it, and rightly so, I think. The first is, we came across a new reservoir of infection that we were not anticipating at the beginning. This is going to be true in many potential alternative diseases. You don't see these right till the very end when something odd happens to the epidemiology and then you start looking for them. But the second point I'd like to make is we're spending at the moment probably in the order of about £30 million a year on this campaign for 106 cases in the last year. If you think about it in terms of cost per case averted, that's a huge investment. Only worthwhile if you're going to get to the end successfully. If you don't, that is an extraordinarily inefficient allocation of resources that could be used elsewhere. And the reason people still invest in this is we think getting to the end is a realistic bet. So those are just some examples from individual cases. Excuse me, I'll just get some water. Some examples from individual cases of the kind of problems that can occur, and every disease throws up a particular set of technical challenges. But there are some generic issues which are going to be true for all diseases as you come near the end. The first of which is you move from a situation where the disease is everywhere to a situation where it's in islands that get smaller and smaller and more difficult to find. And very many of these islands may have transmission rates that are just as high as they did at the beginning of the campaign, able to sustain it in multiple little pockets, whilst around them is a sea of areas which are not. That becomes problematic, and inevitably these tend to be in marginalised areas, difficult to reach areas, or areas of political instability. By definition, that's where these will be. So they may be quite difficult to find. The second one, which of course is well known, is that you are deliberately creating extreme selection pressure on the organism you're trying to eradicate. Therefore, you're accelerating any process of wishing to actually, if there's a possibility to evolve around the drug, the vaccine, or the insecticide you've got, this will really put pressure to accelerate that process. And that we did see that in the first malaria eradication campaign. And thirdly, new modes of transmission and new reservoirs will often be found. I suspect there are, for example, mosquitoes passing on malaria in Africa we're not even aware of, and we will only become aware of when we get to really low levels, which will mess up our calculations as to how we can do it. Now, one of the things that I think unfortunately doesn't help us is that there are a lot of extremely optimistic modelers out there, and they're optimistic about three things: getting money for their models and publishing them. They're optimistic about their own phenomenal powers of abilities to foresee the future, and they tend to actually have optimism biases built into many of their models. The problem we have with the end game, I'm talking about modelling it before you start, is it'll end up being multiple islands of different transmission you don't know where, with modes of transmission you probably don't know as well, and the majority of the problems, as I'll come on to, are going to be social and political, which are very difficult to model epidemiologically anyway. So I've always found some of the more optimistic things that it is possible to model the end game from the beginning surprising, to be honest. And the trouble is that because you've got a model that tells you can do something, that reinforces your optimism bias that it's possible. So I'm not sure these are altogether helpful in public health terms. Alongside that, there is a real risk to any really realistic eradication or elimination campaign of eradication or elimination cannibalism. If you look at the history of the smallpox eradication campaign, successful, it was almost derailed on several occasions by the concurrent malaria eradication campaign. If you read the memoirs of D.A. Henderson, who did that, this becomes extremely clear. And actually, every time you look at eradication campaigns, what you find is that there tend to be competitions. And the competitions are for obvious reasons. The same donors are putting money at the top of the pipe, and the same people are delivering it at the bottom of the pipe on the ground. In between, there may be very stovepiped individual eradication programs, but at the top and the bottom, you've basically got the same people. And that's made worse, I think, to predict by the fact that many eradication campaigns start off synergistic. So, for example, a filariasis eradication campaign and a malaria eradication campaign would look very, very similar when you're in the attack phase, because they're both going to be targeting mosquitoes, amongst many other things. But as you get closer and closer to the end, their needs and the demands they'll put on the public health system will begin to diverge. So running several eradication campaigns, I think, is something we should be very cautious about. And the reason I make that point is this. Why is it that there's such an enthusiasm for using the words eradication or elimination simultaneously in multiple diseases? And the answer, I'm afraid, is money. There has been an assumption by many advocacy groups that if you use eradication and that shows you're bold and enthusiastic, you will get more money than if you don't. But if we try to do all of these simultaneously, that would, I think, be a real strain on the donor and the delivery systems of many of the countries we're talking about. And I think this is really the first political point I'd like to make. Single disease advocates are often enthusiastic about calling for eradication. My view is they should fear it very greatly. By definition, if you call for eradication, you're asking the world to overinvest in your disease compared to every other disease. That is you're asking them to do. You're basically asking them to take money away from other public health concerns and give it to you. It gets your disease talked about, you appear in the media, you tend to attract a certain amount of research funding. That's the good, that's the front end, that's when you're doing your early attack phase. But at the end of it, and this is a point the last talk made really well, the money dries up. And if the money dries up, and you've failed at the point the money dries up, this is seen as an abject failure, and people will not believe you again for a generation. This is what we found with malaria, what we found with yours. Eradication is only sensible to call for if you really care about a disease, if you're guaranteeing you're going to succeed. If not, the promise of eradication, even if you get very considerable success, as with the first malaria eradication attempt, is seen as a failure, and that leads to a disinvestment of an irrational sort. And the reason, and this is my gloss on the last talk, which I very much enjoyed, is there is a political paradox to eradication. It is most popular where it is least realistic. If you ask a Minister of Health in West Africa, would you like to eradicate malaria, they will say yes without any hesitation. For them, this is the primary thing that their families are concerned about, the families who vote for them are concerned about. In West Africa, we are a very, very long way away from eradication. We can get rid of almost all the deaths now. We know how to do that. But eradication, we are a very, very long way away from, for perfectly good epidemiological reasons. Latin America, technically we could eradicate, or we could eliminate locally. But you won't find many ministers of health in Latin America talking about that because they do not see the point where they are. So there is a mismatch between the enthusiasm and the technical possibility. And that geographical mismatch is actually compounded by the political paradox in terms of time. At the beginning of an eradication campaign, people are very enthusiastic. They see a huge problem. Then you start to succeed. People remain very enthusiastic at this point because the disease is dropping very, very fast. By the time you get to here, the disease, for perfectly straightforward mathematical reasons, leaving aside anything else, is now dropping very slowly in terms of total numbers. The rate of change may be the same, but the numbers are going down relatively slowly, and other disease priorities have moved up relative to your one. So this Minister of Health retires very happy. This Minister of Health retires also very happy. This Minister of Health is going to have other people clamouring about the fact, why are you not giving stuff to pneumonia? How about all the diarrheal disease? So this Minister of Health only inherits a problem to which they see an endless solution, and yet this bit of the curve actually costs more than this bit. If you're a politician, that's an extraordinarily unappetizing situation to find yourself in. So eradication campaigns will only work if they can move from here to here in a short enough time, people basically can remember the beginning of them. If it's going to go on a very long time, you are politically dead. Within my advice as someone who has to work on the political and science interface. And adding to that, there are very substantial social and political risks of the endgame, as the recent tragic deaths around polio, for example, demonstrate very clearly. Because one of the things you get is, as you get to the end of an eradication campaign, groups of people who you didn't know about start saying, you're not in our name, we don't support you in this. It may be because they always were against it. It may be because they see external interference, maybe political mischief making. But for whatever reason, you will get groups who are resistant, and they will tend to be in the very areas where you've got the most problems. And polio demonstrated that very clearly. But if you look at the history of, for example, the smallpox campaign, you find there was also deep dislike of the smallpox campaign and actual violence, and there was also in the malaria eradication campaign towards the end, as certain groups who really had never bought into it found themselves being impacted. So this is quite problematic, and one of the things we found with polio, for example, is that it's extremely easy to weave conspiracy theories into eradication campaigns, because what you see is a huge amount of effort around a disease that no one's seeing, and everyone says why. And it's then extremely easy to turn that narrative into one where, instead of these wonderful people who are trying to eradicate this disease, it's these people who don't care about our problems, they've just got their own problems, and this becomes a politically very toxic mix. Finally, on to this point about sticky control and elimination that was raised very well in the last talk. Elimination is politically much lower risk if it is sticky. So if the point you get down to when the politics or the money runs out is where you stick, then actually the risks of that are quite low, because you've done a huge advantage. The area under the curve is going to look very satisfactory. If on the other hand it's going to bounce back up again, that's going to be problematic. Now you can to some degree predict where things are going to be sticky, and you can basically predict it by roughly what the R0 force of transmission is at its natural state. If it's around about 1, it'll come down quite a long way. And I'm talking in very broad terms here. You know, there's more subtleties to this. If it's 100, as it is in some areas for malaria, for example, then as soon as you take your foot off the gas, it's going to bounce back up again. So it should be possible to predict where elimination may be sticky, in which case I think the political risks are relatively low, and where it is very unlikely to be sticky, in which case the political risks are extremely high. And then there's some additional issues around, is the area you've cleared, for example, like to have reintroduction, and are there ways in which you can shift the R0 permanently below 1, in which case you will succeed. So I'd like to finally, before I just draw my conclusions, end up with a quotation from D.A. Henderson. I think it's worth taking seriously, because he's the only man who can be said to have led a successful human disease eradication campaign. And what I put on the screen is what he said. I believe it is critical we should not be blinded to a range of new public health programme paradigms by staring too fixedly at the blinding beacon of a few eradication dreams. So eradication, which I have to be clear, I am very keen on, but keen on it being successful, can mobilise new enthusiasm, it can lead to new tools. Guinea worm eradication, for human disease at least, will succeed. Polio will if we can sustain the long haul. And the excitement around malaria eradication has undoubtedly led to new thinking. These are all fantastic gains to the field. But trying and then failing to have eradication is costly, pulls resources from other priorities, tends to breed cynicism, and can destroy control programs. And there are good examples for each of those. I think it's fair to say, if you look at the history of eradication campaigns, that anything that can go wrong will. That's always a sensible planning assumption. And that political enthusiasm will, for the reasons I've given, completely logically evaporate as you get near the end point. That is just going to happen. And you've got to be able to see a way through that, because it's an inevitability. So my conclusion from that is, by all means go for eradication, but don't call for it when we can't do it. And for most diseases, we can't. But once we are there, we have to be committed with determination, organisation, stoicism, very deep pockets, because it always costs a lot more than the people who originally planned it think it's going to, innovation, flexibility, particularly towards the end. And I think this is one of the interesting things about eradication campaigns is the attack phase, you do the same thing really well everywhere. The end phase is about a series of small tactical battles where you have to do different things in different places. And that's a complete change of mindset that many eradication campaigns have failed to achieve. And flexibility. Thank you very much.